Greetings and welcome back to room 303 at AP English. We turn now in our study of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure to a series of comments by the great Michael Segrue. I want you to take notes, flow the lecture.
I'm going to talk about Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure today. And before I go directly into the details of Shakespeare's play, I'd like to step back a little bit from drama and talk about the genres of comedy and tragedy. The reason why is because Shakespeare is one of the most remarkable of literary artists in the sense that he is capable of producing both comedy and tragedy at a grand scale. He's capable of taking both of those genres of drama to their maximum potential. So the contrast between them may be of some use to us because the comedy we're going to look at today, Measure for Measure, is one of Shakespeare's great underrated achievements. And the first thing we should consider is the fact that comedy and tragedy characteristically end differently. Comedies end in marriage, tragedies end in death. If you think of things like the Greek tragedies, almost all of Greek tragic heroes have some fatal flaw, do something wrong, make a mess of their lives, and at the end of it they die. But before their death, a tragic hero always meets some realization about the human condition, finds out about their fatal flaw, and the consequence of that is that they realize something about the human condition. Tragedy is a very fatalistic sort of dramatic form. Comedy is different. Comedies characteristically end in marriage rather than death. And this difference, or this juxtaposition between ending in death or ending in life, because marriage can be thought of as symbolic sex, but also it's connected with generation and reproduction. And what that means is that comedy is more closely connected in its conclusions with life and with continuity. Tragedy is about death and it's about finality. In addition to that, I would be inclined to say that tragedy is about individuals, whereas comedy is about types. Think of Shakespeare's great tragedies. Hamlet is not an example of a prince of Denmark. He is not an example of a man who thinks too much and acts too little. He is specifically Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. King Lear is not merely a foolish old man that gave his daughters his kingdom. In fact, he is a specific man that did a specific thing. All of tragedy individuates, and tragedy is always about specific individual people. Comedy, on the other hand, surprisingly enough, is not primarily about specific people. Primarily, comedy is about types. We can think of many examples. The best could be taken from Molière. Think about some of the titles of Molière's great comedies. The Miser. Not Joe the Miser, but rather the Miser, the general type of the miser. The Misanthrope. Not Bob the Misanthrope, but the misanthropic man. Even something like Molière's play Don Juan falls into that category. Let me try to illustrate that by comparing, say, the way we think about comic and tragic heroes. Suppose we had a young man who was excessively attracted to women and slept around a lot. We might be tempted to say, he's a real Don Juan. The reason why is that Don Juan is not a specific person. Don Juan is the type of the promiscuous man. So although it may appear that Molière is violating the rule, in fact, Don Juan is a type of a person. Let's juxtapose that same young man. Instead of sleeping around a lot, let's imagine that he's very jealous about the woman in his life. None of us would be tempted to say, he's a real Othello. Even though Othello himself was a man whose tragic flaw was his excessive jealousy. The point is, Othello is a specific person, and we are not inclined to make the analogy from Othello or Hamlet or King Lear to people in the world around us. On the other hand, comic heroes that are not quite as grand as the tragic strutting and roaring, are much more like us, and as a consequence of that, they become indistinguishable types. They are kinds of people. This works for the comedies of Aristophanes as well. I'm going to try and make the argument today that it works for Shakespeare's comedies. In particular, I would say that it works for Shakespeare's greatest comedy, Measure for Measure. Measure for Measure, it was written in 1604, around the same time that Shakespeare was writing his great tragedies. This is within a few years on either side of Macbeth, Lear, Hamlet, Othello. It's strange to see the fact that Shakespeare is perhaps the preeminent literary switch hitter in the Western tradition. Shakespeare is capable of producing both superior comedies and superior tragedies on the fly, without noticeable disjunction in the way he thinks about the world. Now, I would like to take it a little bit further and make a more complicated argument. I would like to argue that tragedy is intrinsically a non-Christian art form. The tragedy is intrinsically pagan. Think about the way in which a tragedy characteristically ends. Greek tragedy is a good example. Choose something like Antigone. At the end of the play, she dies. What she finds out is that she has had some terrible flaws. She has been the cause of her own demise. The point of tragedy, both Greek tragedy and Shakespearean tragedy, is that this superior hero finds out something about themselves that they didn't know before, and they also find out something about the human condition. And when they find this out about the human condition, that there is no recourse for human beings, that eventually we all die, and even superior people cause their own destruction, we are left with a very fatalistic outlook on life. My argument then is that it's not accidental that tragedy is caught up with the ancient Greek tradition. It's not possible to write a tragedy from the Christian perspective, because at the end of a Christian life, the person dies, but that's not all there is to the story. Inevitably for a Christian, there is God's judgment thereafter, and that utterly changes the meaning of the life for a Christian. So my argument then is that if you look over the history of literature, you will never find a tragedy, a true tragedy, written from the Christian perspective, because at the end of a tragedy, the tragic hero has to die unredeemed. The whole point of Christianity, or one of the major points, is the idea of redemption and judgment for individual sins. Now, on the other hand, in contrast to tragedy, comedy can be a Christian art form. And I want to argue, at least in the case of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, that this is the Christian dramatic form, and that Shakespeare's Measure for Measure is the Christian comedy. I want to try and make the rather large argument that Shakespeare's Measure for Measure is the greatest comedy written in the Western tradition. Now, I'll make the argument in aesthetic terms. In other words, this is my feeling about it. You need not adopt my feelings. But I'll try and make a good argument. First, that Shakespeare is hunting intellectual big game in Measure for Measure. He is actually trying to recapitulate the entire Bible in the form of a comedy, which is an amazing intellectual achievement, and also it marks an apogee of intellectual aspiration and ambition. Even if he doesn't completely pull this off, the idea of reducing the entirety of the Bible, and more importantly, the entirety of the Christian view of history, to one narrative, taking the form, the allegorical form of a comedy, if he were to pull that off, and if I were able to make that argument, I believe that we would be faced with the greatest of Shakespeare's comedies. And I think it would be proper to argue that Shakespeare's comic achievements are at least at the level of his tragic achievements. It is often the case that we pay more philosophical attention to tragedy. Tragedy gets all the good ink spilled over it. We only have Aristotle's discussion of tragedy and not of comedy. Perhaps the history of comedy would have been different if we had. But I'd like to try and make the unusual argument that Shakespeare's Measure for Measure is the greatest Christian comedy and one of Shakespeare's greatest achievements. Now, I don't mean to say that Shakespeare himself was a Christian. I doubt that very much. The man that could write King Lear does not have any great hope of eternal salvation and eternal life. The man who writes such fine tragedies must have a heavy dose of the pagan in him. My feeling is, rather, that Shakespeare is the most extraordinary of intellectual switch hitters. He was able to produce both comedy and tragedy, and when he was producing this particular comedy in 1604, he decided that he would go and organize this work of art completely from the Christian perspective. Not because he was a devout Christian, like someone like St. Augustine, but rather because he was intellectually showing off. He wanted to show that he was the ultimate literary artist, and that he could write the best possible play in any sort of genre. So I think that the intellectual ambitions of Measure for Measure do not reflect Shakespeare's Christian leanings. They actually reflect something much more like pagan vanity. I believe it was Plato at the end of the Symposium that says that the same artist could write great tragedies and great comedies. Well, very few have lived up to that possibility. Shakespeare has decided that he shall. Now, Measure for Measure. The characters are of great importance in this, and I'll start with them before I go to the plot. There is, first of all, a series of minor characters that have no real symbolic importance. These are Elbow, Pompey, Froth, and Mistress Overdone, and they are the patrons of a brothel, and Mistress Overdone is the proprietor of a brothel, and these people offer us throughout the course of the play, at various critical moments, comic relief. And comic relief is very important in a comedy that means to encapsulate all of Christianity. In other words, it would fail in its comic purpose. If it didn't have certain slapstick elements in it, you would lose the sense of it being a comedy. It would be far too serious. So Shakespeare, knowing how to balance these things, has written in an oblique way comic relief that is not part of the essential structure symbolically of the play. Now, the other characters are all symbolic, and I want to make the argument that the whole Christian view of history is here, and that every one of the main characters has a Christian symbol attached to it. The first is the Duke. Now, the Duke is the ruler of Vienna, the city in which this play is set, and the Duke, in the beginning of the play, leaves for no reason that's obvious to the people involved. And he delegates his authority to two people, Angelo and Aeschylus. And when he leaves, he returns later on at the end of the play and judges in disguise and removes his disguise and comes out to judge everyone who has been wicked during the course of the play. And that sounds specifically and suspiciously like the end of the world. Let's see how the Duke pans out in the course of this play. The two people that he leaves in charge, I want to call them the personifications of Greek wisdom. The two people he leaves in charge are named Aeschylus and Angelo. Aeschylus did not get his name accidentally. Aeschylus is a wise old man who understands human frailties and human flaws. He's constantly arguing for mercy, given the fact that people cannot always meet the standard of the law. Aeschylus understands human frailty and the impossibility of creating a perfect political order. The other element in the Greek tradition that gets this authority from the absent Duke is named Angelo, and the name itself gives away Angelo's predispositions. Angelo is the man who thinks that he can be perfect. Angelo represents the tradition of Platonic perfectionism. Angelo thinks that since he has never been tempted by the various sins that he sees in other people, that he is immune to them. He believes that he's better than they are. He believes that he's capable of standing in for the Duke. And he's going to try and stand in for the Duke, but it will turn out that our would-be angel, our would-be perfect man, is incapable of perfection, and sin, particularly the sin of lust, the sin which is connected with the fall of man at the beginning of the Bible, turns out to be his downfall, a sin that he had never experienced before. So in addition to the Duke, who's gone, and Aeschylus and Angelo, we have several other characters which would be relevant to our symbolic analysis. The first will be Lucio. Now you can guess who Lucio is from his name. He's Lucifer, he's the devil, he's the tempter, and he's a great patron of the whorehouse that has been recently pulled down, and he's involved in many of the scenes of comic relief. And in addition, not only is he a hellion, and not only is he a tempter, he is great at blaspheming. He is great at saying that he knows the Duke well, and he knows full well that the Duke likes to drink and likes to chase women, and has a great many moral vices. Lucio is in fact the role of the devil in this play. He represents sin and he represents temptation. And we'll see how that pans out in the course of the play. Now, another key figure in this play is Isabella. Isabella is a novice nun. She has not taken her final vows yet, but she is extremely pious, extremely devoted. She spends a great deal of time praying and fasting and involved in mortification of the flesh, and she is virgin. The key thing here is not virginity by itself, but rather virginity as a symbol of uncorrupted selfhood, of a lack of a sinful nature, or at least not succumbing to the temptations of sin. She will maintain her chastity throughout the play. May I suggest that she may well represent the Christian church? In fact, Isabella is an attempt to talk about the relationship between church and state, and her interaction with Angelo, the man that would be perfect, will turn out to be most intriguing for our understanding of how the Christian will view history. Now, another key figure in this play, he has somewhat of a minor role, but he sets the ball rolling in terms of the plot, is named Claudio. Claudio is Isabella's brother, and Claudio has been caught in fornication. He has gotten his betrothed with child. And as a result of that, when the Duke leaves, because there had been a considerable amount of license in Vienna, when the Duke leaves, Angelo passes judgment on Claudio. He says, Claudio, you must die for your sins. Now, what we get out of that is a situation of great tension. This is the first act of the play. The Duke has departed. Angelo and Aeschylus don't know what to do. Angelo, the man who would be perfect, who would be personally perfect, but also the man who would create a perfect political order. He is that drive towards Platonic perfectionism. Angelo says, from now on, the law will be enforced without regard to pity or mercy. We will create a perfect political order. Now that the Duke is gone and I have all the authority in Vienna, I am now going to enforce the law. We'll have moral perfection. Angelo believes himself right in trying to enforce moral perfection because Angelo believes that he is without sin. We will find many biblical references throughout the course of this play, but to those of you who know the parable that's in the Synoptic Gospels about the woman taken in adultery, where Jesus invites the crowd that wants to stone her and says, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Well, Angelo would be up in front of the line, ready to cast the first stone because he has not absorbed the Christian message. He believes that he is without sin, and that gives him the right to judge other people. Consider just briefly the title, Measure for Measure. Those of you that know the Gospels perhaps know Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, where it says, judge not, that you may not be judged. For with what judgment you judge, you yourself shall be judged. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. Yes, indeed, this is a play about justice, and it's about mercy, and it's about the possibility of extending charity to all people, because all human governments are made up of frail and fallible and sinful people who are themselves in need of charity and mercy along with justice. The measure you give will be the measure you get back. So we get the Duke departed. Angelo has decided that he will be something superhuman, that he will deal out justice in God's stead, and he will enforce the law perfectly. Lucio, in the second scene of the first act, he finds out that his friend, Claudio, who has been engaging in this fornication, is now being sent off to jail and is condemned. And he does what seems to be his only altruistic thing in the whole play, because Lucio is constantly unkind and constantly evil, constantly miserable. He says, well, I must go help my friend Claudio. And the way in which he decides to go help his friend Claudio is to go to the nunnery where his sister Isabella is awaiting to take her vows, and persuade her to go and intercede with Angelo for the life of her brother. The point being that although this appears to be altruistic and this appears to be a kind-hearted thing, in fact it is exactly the opposite. What Lucio has done here is set one saint or one would-be saint against another, one who really understands Christian morality and the other who is a Pharisee, a hypocrite, a would-be perfect individual. And whichever one falls and whichever one remains steadfast, he can't help but win. So in fact, Lucio, the tempter, is setting one image of virtue against another image of virtue, knowing that they both cannot stand. In fact, it is a carefully and diabolically crafted scene. Isabella, the pure, virginal, chaste, and moral nun, goes to Angelo, and the scene is remarkable. In the wings, we have Lucio, the tempter, and Isabella doesn't know what to say. She's not used to dealing with politicians, and at the sides, as she delivers her speech, asking for mercy for her brother, she is inclined to hold back because she knows that there's a certain degree of justice in it. She believes fornication to be an evil. She thinks that her brother merits punishment. She feels that the punishment is excessive. She is pleading for mercy. Her pleas for mercy go unanswered, but they gradually begin to melt Angelo. Angelo begins to melt like an ice cube, but from the inside out. He melts in the soul first. For the first time in his life, Angelo feels lust. Angelo begins to feel sexual desire, and Angelo, the man who would be perfect, starts to become corrupt. There is a saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, when the Duke leaves, he leaves under very mysterious circumstances. We don't quite know why he would do that. It turns out that he wishes to test Angelo, because he knows that of all the men in his kingdom, Angelo is the one of the highest moral character. And if it turns out that Angelo is incapable of bearing the responsibility of political power, that means that there is no human being that can dispense God's justice. And if that's the case, Then the idea of perfecting society, ignoring the tragic insight that human beings are essentially flawed and incapable of perfection. This play is an elaborate Christian criticism of that stance. Consider how the play develops. When we get to the scene with Angelo and Isabella and Lucio in the wings, telling her, a little bit harder, a little bit further, come on, persuade him, you want your brother's life. He keeps on egging her on, and the more he eggs her on, the more persuasive her arguments become, and the more persuasive her arguments become, the more Angelo begins to melt. It's a remarkable psychological play, because when she leaves, he is totally unnerved. He said, oh no, for the first time, I have encountered lust, and I don't know what to do. And he says in particular, oh, cunning devil, who to catch a saint baits his hook with a saint. Oh yes, the snares of Satan are very carefully laid in this play. And once you begin to realize that it's to be understood at the allegorical, symbolical level, it all begins to fall together. Well, the Duca is waiting in the wings while Angelo does these deeds, while he is involved in dispensing justice, a very harsh justice to Claudio. And while Isabella is talking to him, Angelo says, look, away, maid, come back and talk to me tomorrow. I cannot talk to you today. Obviously, he is losing his grip. We cut away and we see that in the next scene, third scene, the Duke is back, but he's back in disguise. Yes, the Duke has returned to Vienna, but he hasn't come in pomp and circumstance looking like a political leader. He has come back disguised as a friar, disguised as a holy man. The friar will overhear all the things that the Duke is not meant to overhear throughout the play. This theme of overhearing when people think they're alone is in fact a gesture at God's omnipotence and omniscience. God knows all, even the secrets that we believe we are keeping from the public. It turns out that the friar spends a great deal of his time overhearing secret plans and making sure that they do not result in immoral consequences, making sure that everyone maintains their position on the straight and narrow.